Give me a quick test.
Test, test. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Thank you, Josh. This is a portrayal of what a fluent reader looks like, moving through the steps required to decode a single word. So we start off with the brain recognizing a word in the first 50 milliseconds of time, and that's where the visual areas in the brain are activated. And as we move through time, and at the next 100 milliseconds, the brain begins to examine the physical features of letters and try to match them to features of previously stored information, where you might say, I've seen these letters before. And then we're moving into the next 100 milliseconds, and the brain tries to recognize the whole word by activating the visual word form area. Familiar and frequently occurring words are identified quickly by sight, and that's because we have that ability to map that speech and print together rapidly and easily. We've seen the words a number of times. And then over the next 200 milliseconds to 300 milliseconds, meaning and sound is activated, and the word is accessed. And the first 300 milliseconds are critical for word storage and recognizing that word, because after the first 300 milliseconds, another word enters the system and it competes for attention. So that's a critical period of being able to access, and why fluency and automaticity are so important. One of the things that we know about dyslexic students is they're slower to process each stage, from anywhere from 50 to 100 milliseconds. And if these words aren't stored in our long-term memory all at once, if that doesn't happen rapidly and quickly, the word gets dumped and the brain moves on, and therefore we lose meaning and we can't focus our attention. That executive functioning has shifted, and we're losing that ability to decode rapidly and to understand what we're reading. So thank you, Josh, for giving me that opportunity to talk about that. And here's our brain in the different areas of the brain. When we talk about what's happening in the brain, you'll see up at the front, in the frontal lobe, the phonological processor, and then at the back you see the orthographic processor, and this term that we're using called the visual word form area. And that's an area that's recently been identified by Stanislas Dehaene. A great resource is The Reading Brain and Marion Wolf's Proust and the Squid, where they really go into detail to explain those areas of what happens in beginning reading. Those two areas come together in the angular gyrus, and that's when that decoding is activated. Then we have other parts of the brain in Wernicke's area that are the meaning and context processor, where those are also activated as you become a proficient reader and are able to make sense of words and move into that reading for meaning instead of learning to read. So a little bit about the brain and what's happening there. The final step here is that we have the Scarborough's reading rope, which helps us to understand in more detail what's happening in the reading process. And we have our foundational skills that are at the bottom strands of the rope: the phonological awareness, decoding, and sight recognition. And those, as you see the arrow to the right that says increasingly automatic, you see that a beginning reader has to have those foundational skills in place in order to become fluent and automatic. And at the same time, we have the upper strands, the language comprehension strands, which are building. And as a beginning reader, those are usually built through read-alouds and through conversations, rich language, and becoming aware of lots of vocabulary and language structures that their children are exposed to through those read-alouds. And you'll notice the word vocabulary is extra large in the upper strands, because vocabulary contributes 50 to 60% of the meaning to comprehension. If I need to know what 95% of the words mean in order for me to comprehend the text. And then, of course, vocabulary is closely linked to background knowledge. If I have background knowledge around a specific area, I have vocabulary that is linked to that background knowledge. Our language structures and knowing how the syntax of language and how sentences work together, and especially understanding longer sentences, compound, complex sentences, understanding things like adverbial phrases and how those words carry meaning when combined together. That's an important part of our language comprehension. And then the verbal reasoning adds in that strand, thinking about metaphoric language and the ability to make inferences. And then finally, the literacy knowledge, which is the structure of text, the different types of genre are part of those strands of language comprehension. And so we call comprehension strategies strategic, and learning how to become strategic. And the outcome of all of these things wrapped together is we have a proficient reader, and that skilled proficient reading is necessary and requires all strands. If you were to pull a single strand out of the rope, we would have a breakdown. So there's great value in using the strands of the rope for data and assessments and being able to identify where a student might have a difficulty and why reading is not proficient. We have a number of assessments, especially in the early years, to identify the lower strands of the rope and to specifically assess for those. And then the upper strands, oftentimes people will say we have students that have reading comprehension issues, but by using the 5 upper strands, you can begin to pinpoint where those issues might be and asking questions about, is it vocabulary? Is it the background knowledge? Do they understand language structures? Can they speak in complete sentences? Do they understand those longer sentences within academic and literate text? Do they have good verbal reasoning skills? And do they understand literacy knowledge? Those are things that I can use to be more analytical about comprehension issues with my students. So there's a little overview of the rope, and then the beautiful connections that we see for the state of Oklahoma, the foundational standards, along with the 8 standards that guide our Oklahoma state standards. All right. Thanks so much. I said more than I meant to, but